The charity gala was taking place in the big glass conservatory attached to the city's most expensive hotel. It was a beautiful room, not at all like the old-fashioned buildings with heavy doors that people usually imagine. Here, the walls were made of clear glass, looking out over the city lights that twinkled like tiny stars in the distance. Inside, the air smelled amazing. It was a mix of sweet flowers, expensive perfumes, and the rich smell of roasted meat and garlic butter coming from the buffet tables. There was no bad weather to worry about. The sky above was clear and full of stars. Mirroring the sparkle of the diamond jewelry worn by the women in the room, Julian Thorne stood right in the middle of all this luxury. He was a man who had a lot of money, millions of dollars. In fact, he liked people to know it. He wasn't a very tall man, but he stood with his chest puffed out, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars. He held a glass of champagne in one hand, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just told. It wasn't a very funny joke, but Julian laughed anyway because he liked the sound of his own voice in the room. He felt powerful here. He felt like the king of the castle around him. Other rich people were mingling. The men wore dark suits and shiny shoes, while the women wore colorful dresses that swished when they walked. They were all talking about stock markets, vacations to private islands, and new art pieces they had bought. It was a world where everything was shiny and clean, and no one ever had to worry about how much a loaf of bread costs. The waiters moved through the crowd like ghosts, carrying silver trays stacked high with food. There were tiny shrimp cocktails, little pieces of steak on sticks, and fancy glasses with pink soup in them. While the guests enjoyed themselves, music played softly in the background. But not many people were paying attention to the piano player in the corner. He was a hired musician, playing calm songs that were meant to be ignored. At the far edge of the room, near a large potted plant, stood two young girls. They were twins, looking exactly alike, with the same dark hair pulled back into tight braids. They were about 10 years old, small and thin for their age. They were wearing simple cardigans that looked a bit too big for them. Their shoes were clean, but old, the soles worn down from walking a lot. They didn't belong at this party. They weren't guests. They were waiting for their father, who worked in the kitchen downstairs washing dishes. The two girls, let's call them Sophie and Rose, were doing their best to be invisible. They stood very still, holding hands. Their stomachs were making loud noises, growling with hunger. They had been at the hotel for hours because their father's shift had run late. He had told them to wait in the lobby, but the lobby was cold, and they could smell the food from the conservatory. It had pulled them up the stairs like a magnet. They didn't want to beg, and they didn't want to cause trouble. They just wanted to see their dad, and maybe, just maybe, get something to eat. Sophie squeezed her sister's hand. "Do you see him yet?" She whispered. Rose shook her head, looking around nervously. "Not yet. Maybe we should go back downstairs. Everyone is staring." It was true. A few guests had glanced at them with frowns, wondering why two children were hovering near the entrance. A security guard walked by, looking at them suspiciously, but when he saw how polite and quiet they were, he just kept walking. The girls felt out of place. The floor here was made of smooth white marble, and they felt afraid to step on it with their old shoes in case they left a mark. Everything around them was gold and crystal. They felt like two plain pebbles in a box of jewels. The hunger was getting worse. They hadn't eaten since lunch, and that had just been a small sandwich shared between the three of them. The smell of the food was torturing them. They watched a waiter walk past with a tray full of chocolate cakes covered in gold leaf. It looked like something from a fairy tale. Julian Thorne was feeling very good about himself. He had just finished telling a story about how he bought a boat and decided he didn't like the color, so he bought another one. His friends laughed, stroking their egos. Julian took a sip of his drink and turned around, looking for someone new to impress. That was when he spotted the twins. He stopped laughing. He squinted his eyes, looking across the room. To him, these girls didn't look like children waiting for a parent. They looked like intruders. They looked like a problem. Who let the stray kittens in? Julian muttered to the woman standing next to him. She chuckled, thinking he was just being his usual witty self, but the girls heard him. They didn't understand the stray kittens part, but they knew he was talking about them. Sophie pulled Rose behind the large plant, trying to hide. "I am hungry, Sophie," Rose whispered, her voice shaking. "It hurts." "I know," Sophie said, her brave voice fading. "Me too." They knew they shouldn't be there, but the smell of the warm food kept them glued to the spot. They saw a waiter putting a fresh plate of food on a side table, a plate that someone had probably ordered but walked away from. It was a beautiful plate with a stack of roast beef and mashed potatoes. There was even a little bit of gravy. Taking a deep breath, Sophie decided to be brave. She let go of Rose's hand and walked toward the waiter. Her legs felt weak and her heart was beating very fast. She felt like everyone in the room was watching her. Even though most people were still busy talking, she approached the waiter who was adjusting his tie. He looked busy and annoyed. He was holding a heavy tray of dirty glasses and looked ready to leave the floor. "Excuse me, sir," Sophie said in a very small voice. The waiter didn't look down. He just grunted yes. "What do you want? You're not supposed to be back here." Sophie swallowed hard. We are very hungry. We were wondering if maybe we could have a plate of food." "To share, please. We are waiting for our dad." The waiter sighed loudly, finally looking down. When he saw the two scruffy girls, his expression didn't soften. Instead, he looked annoyed that he had to deal with this. He didn't see their hunger or their politeness. He just saw a mess. "Look, this is a private event," the waiter snapped, though he kept his voice low so the guests wouldn't hear. "You can't just come in here asking for handouts. Go back to the kitchen or go outside." "But our dad works here," Rose piped up from behind the plant, stepping forward to defend her sister. "He is the dishwasher." "We haven't eaten all day." The waiter rolled his eyes. "I don't care if your dad is the manager. You don't touch the food. Now, go on, before I call the security guard to throw you out." He turned his back on them and stormed off toward the kitchen. Sophie and Rose stood there, stunned. The rejection hurt more than the hunger pangs. They felt tears stinging their eyes, but they were too proud to let them fall in front of all these rich people. They turned around to leave, to go back to the cold lobby, but they couldn't move. The smell of the roast beef was still in the air. The abandoned plate was sitting right there on the table, just a few feet away. It felt like it was mocking them. Julian Thorne was still watching. He had seen the whole thing. He had seen the waiter be rude to them, and he had seen the sad look on their faces. Most people might have felt sorry for them. Most people might have told the waiter to give them a meal. But Julian was bored. He had been to 100 parties like this. He had drunk 100 glasses of champagne. He needed something to entertain him. He didn't see two little girls who were sad and hungry. He saw an opportunity. He put his glass down on a passing tray and smoothed his expensive jacket. A cruel idea formed in his mind. He thought it would be funny to see how far they would go. He thought it would be a good story to tell his friends later. He walked over to the side table where the girls were standing, looking defeated. He didn't walk like a friend. He walked like a predator, circling its prey. He stopped right in front of them, blocking their view of the exit. He looked down at them with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, well," Julian said, his voice loud and oily. "I see you two have quite the appetite, and quite the nerve, coming in here." The girls looked up at him, terrified. He was a big, scary man with a loud voice. "Please, sir," Sophie said quickly. "We were just leaving. We are sorry." No, don't leave on my account," Julian said, waving his hand. "I heard what you told the waiter. You're hungry? You want that plate of food?" He pointed to the roast beef sitting on the table. Both girls nodded slowly. Their eyes were fixed on the food. Julian chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You know, nothing in this world is free, ladies, especially not this beef. It is imported. It is expensive." He paused, letting the silence stretch out. He could see the hope fading from their faces, replaced by confusion. "I tell you what," Julian said, leaning down so he was eye level with them. "I see you looking at the piano over there. I see you tapping your fingers. You play music? Is that what they teach you in?" "Wherever you live." Sophie looked at her hands. She did know how to play. Her mom had taught them on an old keyboard before she got sick. She didn't answer, but she didn't say no. Julian smiled. He thought he had them. He pointed a finger toward the shiny black grand piano in the corner of the room. The spotlight was hitting it just right, making it gleam. "If you want this plate of food," Julian said, pointing to the roast beef with one hand and the piano with the other, "you have to play for it." The girls froze. The room seemed to go quiet around them. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They just wanted to eat. They didn't want to perform like seals. "Play for us," Julian demanded, his voice dropping to a mock-serious tone. "If you play something good, something that isn't boring, you can have the whole plate. Heck, I'll even let you take the silver spoon. But if you are bad or if you are boring, you have to leave immediately. Do we have a deal?" He held out his hand, waiting for one of them to shake it. It was a humiliating offer. It was a cruel test. But Sophie looked at her sister, who was shaking so hard her braids were trembling. She looked at the plate of food. Then she looked at the piano. The hunger in her belly burned like a fire. And she knew she didn't have a choice. The deal hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Julian stood there with his hand out, his grin wide and expectant. He was waiting for the girls to run away. He expected them to cry or get scared. Most people would have. But these two sisters had been through tough times before. They didn't run. Instead, the older twin, Sophie, looked at her sister. Rose was shaking so much that her teeth were chattering, but she wasn't crying. She just looked at her sister with wide, trusting eyes. Sophie knew she had to be strong. She knew that if they walked away now, they would have to go back to the cold lobby and wait for their dad with empty stomachs. The smell of the roast beef was making her mouth water. The thought of eating something warm was too strong to ignore. Slowly, Sophie reached out. Her small, thin hand looked tiny compared to Julian's large, ring-covered fingers. She didn't shake his hand firmly like a businessman. She just touched his palm lightly. "Right. We have a deal," Sophie said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Julian laughed, a sharp barking sound that made a few people turn their heads. He clapped his hands together, delighted. He turned to the small group of people who had gathered behind him. They looked like a pack of wolves, watching the scene unfold with amusement. "Did you hear that, ladies and gentlemen?" Julian announced, puffing out his chest. "We have a show. The little street urchins are going to earn their dinner." The people around him chuckled. Some of them swirled their drinks, looking bored but interested enough to see what would happen. They didn't see the girls as humans. They saw them as entertainment, a break from the dull conversation about stocks and real estate. Sophie took a deep breath. She squeezed Rose's hand one last time and let go. She walked toward the piano. The floor was slippery and shiny, and her old shoes made a squeaking sound that echoed in the quiet room. Every step felt like walking a mile. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back, watching her, judging her clothes, her hair, and her size. She felt exposed, like she was standing on a stage without a costume. The piano was massive. It was a shiny black grand piano that looked like a sleeping beast. It was polished to perfection, reflecting the lights of the chandelier above. To Sophie, it looked like the most expensive thing in the world. The bench was covered in smooth black leather, and there were no scratches on it. Unlike the old, beat-up keyboard she practiced on at home, she climbed up onto the bench. Her feet dangled high above the floor. She couldn't reach the pedals. That didn't matter for the song she was going to play. She didn't need the pedals to make the music speak. She just needed the keys. Julian leaned against a pillar nearby, swirling his champagne. He had a smug look on his face. He was already thinking about the joke he would tell later. "So, two kids walk into a bar and play piano for a sandwich?" he imagined himself saying. He was convinced this was going to be a disaster. He expected them to play chopsticks or twinkle. "Twinkle, little star," he expected to laugh, shake his head, and send them away. But then, Sophie placed her hands on the keys. Her hands were not like the hands of the rich people in the room. Her skin was dry, and her fingernails were bitten short. There were calluses on her fingertips from pressing down on stiff plastic keys for hours. But as soon as her skin touched the cold ivory of the grand piano, she changed. She didn't look like a scared little girl anymore. She sat up straight, her eyes closing gently. Rose stood near the edge of the piano, not too far away. She didn't climb up on the bench. She knew her place. She was there to support her sister. She stood with her hands clasped together, looking at Sophie's face, waiting for the music to start. The room was buzzing with low whispers. The tinkling of glasses and the soft hum of conversation filled the air. No one was really paying attention yet. Then Sophie struck the first chord. It wasn't a happy note. It was low and deep, vibrating through the floor. The sound was so clear and resonant that it cut through the noise of the room like a knife. The whispers stopped instantly. A few people froze, their drinks halfway to their mouths. Sophie didn't play a simple children's song. She began to play a piece that was old and complicated. It was a song by a composer named Chopin, a piece full of sadness and longing. It was music that she had heard her mother play on a cassette tape a long time ago. It was a song that spoke of deep pain and deep love. Her fingers moved across the keys. At first, they were a little hesitant, testing the touch of the expensive instrument. But quickly, she found her rhythm. The left hand played a rolling, steady beat like a heartbeat, while the right hand played a melody that was weeping and soaring at the same time. The sound was not perfect. There was a slight hesitation here and there, a tiny mistake that only a professional would notice. But it didn't matter. The feeling was perfect. Julian's smirk faltered. He took a sip of his drink to hide his confusion, but the taste suddenly seemed bitter. He listened, expecting the music to stop or become silly, but it didn't. The music filled the conservatory. It flowed out of the piano and wrapped around the crystal glasses and the golden decorations. It was hauntingly beautiful. Rose stood by the piano, closing her eyes. She knew this song. She knew exactly what Sophie was thinking. She began to hum softly. Her voice was thin and high, blending perfectly with the notes coming from the piano. She didn't know the words, but she hummed the melody. Adding a layer of ghost-like beauty to the room, the guests were mesmerized. They stopped talking completely. The waiters stopped serving. Everyone turned to look at the small girl dangling her legs from the massive piano bench. It was such a strange sight, this tiny figure in worn-out clothes, creating a sound so big and powerful. The music was sad, but it wasn't hopeless. It sounded like a story of survival. It sounded like someone walking through a storm but keeping their head up. It sounded like cold nights and warm hugs. It sounded like the love the two sisters had for each other, love that kept them going when things were bad. Sophie didn't open her eyes. She was picturing her mother teaching them on their old broken keyboard. She remembered how her mother would smile when they got a note right. She played with all the hunger in her heart. She played for the food on the table, but she also played for the memory of the person who taught her how to feel. Julian felt a strange tightening in his chest. He looked at the roast beef on the table. It looked greedy now. It looked gross. He looked at his own hands, holding the expensive glass. He looked at the people around him. They were all standing still, captured by the music. He suddenly felt very small. He realized that he had tried to buy this moment. He had tried to trade a plate of leftovers for this masterpiece, thinking he was the one in control. But as the music swelled, growing louder and more intense, he realized he wasn't the one in control. The girl on the bench was the powerful one. She had something he couldn't buy. She had a soul that could sing, even when she was starving. The song moved into a faster section. Sophie's fingers flew over the keys, pressing hard, making the piano sing out with a passionate urgency. The hum from her sister rose with it. The glass walls of the room seemed to vibrate with the emotion. There was a woman standing near, Julian wearing a diamond necklace. She had a tear running down her cheek, smudging her expensive makeup. She wasn't wiping it away. She was just listening, remembering something sad from her own past. The music went on for a few more minutes. It felt like a lifetime to everyone in the room. It was as if the clock had stopped. The rich, the powerful, the snobs, they were all held hostage by the talent of two hungry little girls. Finally, the music began to slow down. The rolling heartbeat in the left hand softened. The melody became gentle, like a lullaby. Sophie played the final chords. They were simple and clear, ringing out in the silence. She pressed the last key and held it. The sound faded slowly, drifting up toward the glass ceiling and disappearing into the night. She lifted her hands off the keys and placed them on her lap. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a respectful one. No one clapped. No one cheered. It felt like clapping would break the spell, like it would be an insult to the raw honesty of what they had just heard. Sophie sat on the bench, her shoulders slumping forward. The energy it took to play had drained her. She opened her eyes and looked down at her shoes. She was scared to look at Julian. She didn't know if he liked it. She didn't know if she was going to get in trouble. Rose walked over and gently touched Sophie's knee. "You did good," Rose whispered. Sophie nodded, taking a shaky breath. She slid off the bench and landed on the floor. The two sisters stood together again, holding hands, waiting for the judgment of the man in the suit. They were just two little girls again, waiting for a scrap of food. Julian stood frozen. The glass of champagne felt heavy in his hand. He looked at the roast beef, then at the piano, and finally at the girls. The smirk was long gone. His face was pale. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. The silence in the room was not the usual quiet that falls when someone stops talking. It was a heavy, thick silence that pressed against the glass walls of the conservatory. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes they have just witnessed something real and raw. Something that doesn't belong in a world of fake smiles and expensive parties. Sophie stood by the bench, her hands trembling slightly. She looked down at her feet, feeling the eyes of every single person in the room burning into her. She expected them to laugh. She expected them to throw her out. In her experience, grown-ups with money didn't like being reminded of feelings. They liked things to be easy and happy. She had just poured her heart out, playing a song of sadness and hunger. And now she was terrified she had made a terrible mistake. Rose, her sister, reached out and gripped Sophie's hand tight. Rose was trembling too, but she stood her ground. She glared at the room, a fierce little protector. If anyone was going to laugh, she was going to stare them down. Julian was the only one moving. He was shifting his weight from one foot to the other, looking very uncomfortable. The smirk that usually lived on his face had completely vanished. In its place was a look of confusion. He looked at the piano as if it had turned into a wild animal. He looked at his glass of champagne, then at the plate of roast beef sitting on the table nearby just minutes ago. That plate of food had looked like a bargaining chip to him. It was a tool to prove a point, to show that he was in charge. Now, looking at the cold meat and the potatoes, he felt a wave of sickness in his stomach. It looked like garbage compared to the music that had just filled the air. He remembered the deal he had made. "If you can make me feel a single thing other than bored, you can eat like queens," he had said, laughing. He had wanted to be bored. He had wanted to sit back and watch two little girls fail so he could feel superior. But he wasn't bored. He wasn't superior. He felt small. He felt like he had been punched in the gut. The music had peeled back the shiny surface of his life and showed him the empty space underneath. He realized that while he had been busy buying boats and drinking expensive wine, these two girls were learning how to turn pain into beauty. A few of the guests started to murmur to each other. They weren't whispering jokes anymore. They were whispering in awe. "Did you see her hands?" A woman in a blue dress whispered. They were so fast, but so gentle. "I haven't heard that piece played with that much emotion since." "Well, ever," an older man replied, shaking his head in disbelief. Julian felt his face getting hot. The shame was rising up his neck like a thermometer. He looked at the girls again. They were so small. Their cardigans were thin. Their shoes were worn out. They were shivering slightly in the air-conditioned room. They had done exactly what he asked. They had played. They had won. And yet they were standing there, waiting for permission to eat. Waiting for him to say it was okay. The horror of the situation hit him all at once. He was a millionaire. He owned hotels and factories. He had more money in his bank account than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. And here he was, acting like a cruel king from a storybook. Testing to children who just wanted a meal. He remembered the look on the waiter's face when he had told the girls to leave. He remembered his own sneer when he offered the deal. He felt disgusted with himself. The taste of the champagne in his mouth turned sour. He wanted to spit it out. He wanted to go back 5 minutes and tell himself to stop, to just give them the food, to be kind. But he couldn't go back. He had to deal with the now. Sophie finally looked up. She scanned the crowd, looking for Julian. When their eyes met, she flinched. She couldn't read his expression. He looked angry, but also sad. It scared her. She tightened her grip on Rose's hand. "Mr. Julian?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Did we do okay? Can we have the plate now?" The question was like a slap in the face to Julian. Did we do okay? She was asking him, the man who had mocked her, if she was worthy of a leftover dinner. It broke his heart. It wasn't a physical pain, but a deep ache in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He realized that in his attempt to entertain himself, he had hurt a child's dignity. He had made them feel like they had to perform a trick just to survive. Around them, the atmosphere was shifting. The spell of the music was lingering, making people see things differently. The other guests, who had been amused by Julian's cruelty at first, were now starting to look at him with judgment. They saw a grown man bullying 2 children. The magic of the girl's performance had turned the tables. Julian wasn't the ringmaster anymore. He was the villain of the story. He saw the looks on their faces. The woman in the blue dress was frowning at him. The older man was shaking his head in disappointment. Julian cared a lot about what people thought of him. He wanted to be admired. He wanted to be powerful. But right now he felt weak and hated. He looked at the roast beef one last time. He couldn't just give them the plate. That wasn't enough. If he gave them the plate now, it would feel like he was still paying them off. He needed to do something else, but he didn't know what. His mind was racing. He was sweating in his expensive tuxedo. The silence stretched on. It was becoming awkward. The girls were waiting. The room was waiting. Sophie took a step back, pulling Rose with her. "It's okay," she whispered to her sister. "Let's just go. He's going to say no." "No," Rose whispered back, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "I'm so hungry, Sophie." The sight of the tears broke the dam inside Julian. He couldn't stand it anymore. He couldn't be the bad guy. He couldn't let these children walk away hungry after giving him such a beautiful gift. He took a step forward. His legs felt heavy. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice cracked. He had to cough and try again. "Hey, stop," he said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, but it was soft. The girls froze. They looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. Julian walked over to the table where the food sat. He picked up the silver plate. It was heavy in his hand. He looked at the girls, really looked at them, not as pests or beggars, but as human beings. He saw the dirt under their fingernails. He saw the pale skin of their faces. He saw the exhaustion. "I was wrong," Julian said. His voice was shaky, and it sounded strange in the quiet room. "I was very, very wrong." He didn't hand them the plate directly. Instead, he placed the plate on top of the piano right in front of where Sophie had been sitting. It looked out of place there, a mundane object of survival next to the instrument of art. "You didn't do okay," Julian continued, struggling to find the right words. You played beautifully. It was the best thing I have ever heard. And I am ashamed that I made you ask for food in exchange for it." He lowered his head. He couldn't look them in the eye. "Please," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Eat. Eat as much as you want. It's yours." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The guests were stunned. Julian Thorne, the man who never apologized, the man who never backed down, was apologizing to 2 poor little girls. Sophie and Rose looked at each other. They didn't know what to make of it. They were used to adults yelling or ignoring them. They weren't used to adults saying sorry, but the food was right there. The smell was filling their noses again. Sophie walked slowly to the piano. She picked up a fork. Her hand was shaking so much she nearly dropped it. She took a small piece of roast beef and put it in her mouth. It was warm and salty. It tasted like heaven. She immediately took another piece and held it out to Rose. They ate standing there, next to the piano. They didn't use the chairs. They ate quickly, like they were afraid the food would disappear if they didn't eat it fast enough. Julian stood a few feet away, watching them. He felt a lump in his throat that wouldn't go away. Seeing how hungry they were, seeing the relief on their faces as the food hit their stomachs, it broke him. He looked around the room. The waiters were standing still, watching. The guests were watching. Julian realized that just feeding them wasn't fixing the problem. It was fixing the hunger for tonight. But what about tomorrow? What about next week? These girls had talent. They had a gift that was wasting away in a poor life. He felt a sudden urge to do something more, something that would actually matter. But he didn't know how to do it without sounding like he was trying to buy them again. He stood there, thinking hard, while the girls finished the first plate in record time. They were still looking at the empty plate, still hungry. Julian took a deep breath. He knew he had to act fast. He had to make a real change, not just a charity gesture. He had to show them, and himself, that he could be a better man. "Wait," he said, as Sophie reached out to put the empty plate back on the table. "Don't stop there." He waved his arm, catching the attention of the head waiter. "Bring more food," Julian said, his voice getting stronger. "And bring the best food we have. The steaks, the pasta, the desserts. Bring it all. And set a proper table for these two ladies. They are not eating at a buffet table. They are guests." The waiter hesitated for a second, looking at Julian, then at the girls. He saw the change in the air. He nodded quickly. "Right away, sir." "Ah!" Julian turned back to the girls. He saw the surprise in their eyes. He saw that they were still scared, but there was a tiny glimmer of hope there, too. He knew he couldn't stop there. He looked at the piano, then at the girls' hands. The idea that had been forming in his mind was scary. It meant he would have to get involved. It meant he would have to care. But as he looked at Sophie, wiping a bit of gravy from her chin, he knew he didn't have a choice. The music had changed him. He wasn't the same man who had laughed at them 5 minutes ago. He knelt down on one knee, ignoring the cold marble floor. He wanted to be on their level. He wanted to look them in the eye without looking down on them. "I'm a proposal," Julian said softly. "But this time, it is not a trick. I promise you." Julian stayed there on one knee, ignoring the hardness of the marble floor under his expensive trousers. It was a strange sight for the people in the room. The man who usually stood on podiums giving orders was now looking up at two little girls in worn-out cardigans. The position made him feel vulnerable. But for the first time that night, he felt like he was in the right place. Sophie and Rose stared at him, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. In their short lives, adults rarely did nice things without wanting something in return. They expected him to ask for another song. They expected him to ask for their dad to work extra hours. They were ready for the catch. Julian looked at their faces, searching for the right words. He realized that his usual way of speaking, fast, loud, and demanding, wouldn't work here. He needed to slow down. He needed to speak human to human. "I know you were scared," Julian said softly, "and I know you have no reason to trust me. I was terrible to you. I laughed at you. I made you feel small." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I am so sorry for that, truly." Sophie blinked. She saw a wetness in the corner of his eye. It wasn't a trick. The man was actually sad about what he had done. It made her lower her fork just a little bit. "You played like an angel," Julian continued, glancing at the piano. "I've heard many musicians play in this room. Famous people with degrees and fancy reputations. But none of them made me feel what you just made me feel. You played with your heart, not just your hands." Rose nudged Sophie gently. "He's telling the truth," she whispered. Sophie nodded slowly. She could feel it too. The air in the room wasn't mean anymore. Julian took a deep breath. It was time to say the part that scared him the most. He was about to offer something that would change their lives, but he was terrified they would reject it. Or worse, that they would accept it for the wrong reasons. "Listen to me," Julian said, leaning in closer. "I own a music school downtown. It's called the Thorn Academy. It has the best teachers in the city. It has big concert halls and brand new pianos." He saw Sophie's eyes widen at the mention of pianos. "We have a program there," Julian went on. A scholarship program. It is for kids who have talent but don't have the money to pay for lessons. It covers everything. The lessons, the books, the uniforms, and it provides meals. Hot meals, every single day. He let that sink in. He saw the girls look at each other. He saw the hunger in their eyes mix with a sudden spark of hope. It was a dangerous look, like a flame catching on a dry leaf. I want you to come there, Julian said, his voice trembling with sincerity. I want both of you to enroll. No auditions. You already proved you belong. I want to give you the chance to learn everything there is to know about music. I want to give you the chance to be the best you can be. The silence that followed was heavy. The guests were holding their breath. Waiters stood frozen with trays of food. Sophie looked at the piano, then back at Julian. It sounded like a dream. It sounded like something that happened in storybooks, not in real life. A free school, free food, the chance to play on real pianos whenever she wanted. But Sophie started, her voice small and hesitant. Our dad. He works here. We can't just go to some fancy school. We have to help him. We have to go home. Julian shook his head gently. I've already thought about that. I will talk to your father. I promise you we can make it work so that he doesn't lose his job. In fact, if he agrees, I can find him a better job. A job where he doesn't have to wash dishes until his hands bleed. But that is a conversation for him. For now, I am asking you too. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple white card. It wasn't a business card with gold writing. It was just a plain card with an address on it. He held it out to Sophie. This is the address, Julian said. I want you to ask your father to bring you there tomorrow morning. Can you do that? Sophie looked at the card like it was made of gold. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at Rose. Rose was nodding frantically, tears of hope running down her cheeks. Then she looked at her dirty, calloused hands. She looked at the roast beef on the table. Finally, she looked Julian in the eye. Is this real? Sophie asked. Or is this another joke? Because if it is a joke, please don't do it. It hurts too much. Julian felt a sharp pain in his chest. He realized just how much damage adults had done to these kids. They couldn't even recognize a genuine act of kindness because they were so used to cruelty. It is real, Julian said, his voice firm. I swear on my life, it is real. I made a mistake tonight. I treated you like a game. But you showed me that you are not a game. You are artists. And this is the least I can do to make up for it. Slowly, Sophie reached out and took the card. Her fingers brushed against Julian's hand. He felt how rough her skin was, and it made him want to help them even more. Okay, Sophie whispered. We will ask him. Julian let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He smiled, but it wasn't the smug, arrogant smile from before. It was a soft, genuine smile. Good, he said. Now please, eat. You need your strength. He stood up. His knees cracked a little, making a few people chuckle softly, but it was a kind laugh this time. Julian signaled to the waiters. Bring the main course, and bring some chocolate cake. Lots of it. The waiters sprang into action. Within moments, the small table near the piano was covered in plates of steaming food. There were steaks cooked to perfection, bowls of creamy pasta, and fresh vegetables. And for dessert, a massive slice of chocolate cake with fudge dripping down the sides. Sophie and Rose didn't need to be told twice. They sat down on the plush chairs that the waiters had brought for them. For the next 20 minutes, the room was quiet except for the sound of the girls eating. They ate with a focus that was almost scary. They savored every bite. The chocolate cake left smudges on their faces, but no one cared. Not the waiters, and certainly not Julian. Julian stood by the pillar watching them. He felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The anxiety, the boredom, the need to show off fit was all gone. He felt lighter. He looked at the guests around him. Some of them were whispering, probably wondering why he was making such a fuss over the kitchen workers' children. But Julian didn't care what they thought. He saw a wealthy woman walk over to the table. It was the lady in the blue dress. She had been crying earlier when Sophie played. She stopped near the girls and pulled a diamond ring off her finger. It was small and elegant. Julian watched, afraid she was going to give it to them, which would be too much, too weird. But instead, she just laid a crisp $100 bill next to Rose's plate. "For your dad," the woman whispered. "Tell him he is raising wonderful girls." She walked away quickly before anyone could make a scene. Then, the older man who had praised the music walked up. He took a silk handkerchief from his pocket and set it gently next to Sophie. "To wipe your hands," he said kindly, "and perhaps to remember tonight by—" It started a chain reaction. One by one, guests came by. They didn't give speeches. They didn't ask for autographs. They just left little things. A $20 bill tucked under a plate, a hair clip, a note with a phone number offering piano lessons. Julian watched this flood of generosity. It wasn't about the money, really. It was about the connection. The music had broken down the invisible wall between the rich guests and the poor girls. For a few moments, they weren't millionaires and dishwashers' daughters. They were just people connected by a shared emotion. Eventually, the girls slowed down. They couldn't eat another bite. They leaned back in their chairs, looking sleepy and incredibly full. "We should go find Dad," Sophie said, rubbing her eyes. Julian stepped forward. "I will take you to him." The girls hesitated, looking at the doors that led to the kitchen. They were afraid they would get in trouble for being upstairs. "It's okay," Julian said reassuringly. "I own the hotel. No one is going to yell at you." He walked them to the service elevator. The guests parted like the sea as they passed, showing a respect that Julian had never seen them show anyone before. They stepped into the elevator, Julian standing in the corner to give them space. As the elevator descended, the smell of food and perfume faded, replaced by the smell of soap and cleaning supplies. They were going back to the real world. But Sophie clutched the white card in her hand tight. When the doors opened, the kitchen was loud and busy. Pots were banging, chefs were shouting orders, and steam was rising from huge stoves. It was a harsh contrast to the quiet elegance upstairs. In the corner, a man in a white apron was scrubbing a huge pot. He looked exhausted. His back was bent, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms that were red from hot water. "Addie!" Rose yelled, running out of the elevator. The man turned around, dropping his scrub brush in the soapy water. "Rose? Sophie?" He looked terrified. "What are you doing down here? Did they catch you upstairs?" "Oh, no, no, no. I told you to wait in the lobby." He rushed over, his hands still wet and soapy. He looked from his daughters to Julian, who was stepping out of the elevator. The man's face went pale. He recognized Julian immediately. Everyone in the hotel knew who the owner was. "Sir," the man stammered, backing away, "I am so sorry. I didn't know they were up there. I will make them leave. Please don't fire me. I need this job." He grabbed the girls' shoulders, pulling them behind him as if to shield them from a blow. Julian looked at the father. He saw the fear in his eyes. He saw the love he had for his children. And he saw the same desperation he had seen in his own father's eyes years ago, before Julian became rich. The kitchen went quiet. The chef stopped cooking. The dishwasher stopped scrubbing. Everyone was watching. Julian walked up to the terrified man. He didn't offer his hand to shake. He knew the man's hands were wet and soapy, and he didn't want him to feel embarrassed. "Sir," Julian said, his voice echoing off the stainless steel walls, "your daughters. They are the most talented people I have ever met." The father blinked, confused. What?" "They just played for my guests," Julian continued, "and they played better than anyone I have ever hired. I have offered them a full scholarship to my music academy. Full tuition, meals, everything." The kitchen gasped. The father's jaw dropped. He looked at Sophie, who was holding up the white card. She nodded at him. "And for you," Julian added, "I am promoting you. I need a new manager for the staff dining hall. The hours are better, and the pay is double. You won't have to wash dishes anymore." The father swayed on his feet. He looked like he might faint. "Double," he whispered. "Triple," Julian said, a smile finally breaking through. Because you raised two geniuses, and I want to make sure they have the time to practice." The father looked down at his girls. He saw the chocolate on their faces and the fullness in their bellies. For the first time in years, the heavy weight on his shoulders lifted. He didn't know how to thank this man. He didn't know if it was a dream. "Thank you," the father choked out, tears mixing with the soap on his face. "Thank you so much." Julian nodded. "Don't thank me," he said, looking at the girls. "I should be thanking them. They taught me a lesson tonight that I needed to learn." He turned and walked back toward the elevator, leaving the family hugging in the middle of the chaotic kitchen. He wasn't the same man who walked in. The millionaire had left the building, and in his place was just a man who had learned how to feel again. Asterisk, the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Life for the small family changed so fast that it felt like a dream they were scared to wake up from. The father, a man who had spent years with his hands submerged in soapy water, now walked the floors of the hotel with a clipboard and a clean uniform. He managed the staff dining hall. He wasn't rich, but he didn't have to worry about whether there would be enough money for bread at the end of the day. He walked taller now. His back didn't ache as much, and the constant worry line between his eyebrows had started to fade. But the biggest change was happening a few miles away. At the big stone building of the Thorn Academy, Julian had kept his promise. Sophie and Rose walked through the heavy iron gates of the school every morning. They wore crisp, blue uniforms that felt soft against their skin, and they carried leather backpacks filled with music books instead of old, tattered papers. To the other students, children of lawyers and doctors, they might have looked different. But once they sat down in front of a piano, nobody saw where they came from. They only heard the magic. The director of the music school, a strict woman with white hair and sharp eyes, had been skeptical at first. She didn't like charity cases, but when she heard Sophie play a scale with perfect pitch, and when she saw Rose close her eyes and compose a melody on the spot, her skepticism vanished. She realized these girls had a gift that couldn't be taught. It was something they were born with, every afternoon. While their father finished his shift at the hotel, the sisters stayed late in the practice rooms. They didn't want to go home. They were fascinated by the grand pianos. They loved the way the pedals felt under their feet and how the sound filled the high vaulted ceilings. They practiced scales, classical pieces, and even songs they made up themselves. They were hungry, but this time it wasn't a hunger for food. It was a hunger to learn, to get better, to fill the empty spaces inside them with music. Julian visited the school often. He didn't come to boss people around or to inspect the finances anymore. He came to listen. He would sneak into the back of the practice hall, sitting in the shadows, and just close his eyes. He didn't think about his stocks or his business rivals. He just let the music wash over him. It was the only time he truly felt at peace. One evening, 6 months after the night at the gala, the school held its annual spring recital. The auditorium was packed with parents, teachers, and important guests from the city. The air smelled of beeswax and fresh flowers. The stage was bright with lights, and a shiny black grand piano sat right in the center. Julian sat in the front row. He wasn't there as a donor or a VIP. He was there as a fan. He wore a simple suit, no flashy jewelry. His hands were resting calmly on his knees. He watched the program, waiting for the last names on the list. The recital went on for 2 hours. Students played violins, flutes, and cellos. Some were good, some were okay, but the crowd was waiting for the finale. Word had spread around the city about the dishwasher daughters who could make the piano weep. Finally, the director walked onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, "for our final performance, we have a special duet. Please welcome Sophie and Rose." The applause was polite but expectant. Julian saw the two girls walk out from the side of the stage. They looked different now. They were healthy, their hair was shiny, and they stood with confidence. But they still held hands tightly as they walked to the piano. It was the same bond they had shared in the cold hotel lobby, a silent promise that no matter how famous they got, they would always have each other. Sophie sat on the bench and adjusted the height. Rose stood next to her, ready to turn the pages. They looked out into the dark crowd. They couldn't see faces, just a sea of lights. But Sophie knew where Julian was sitting. She nodded slightly in his direction. They began to play. It was a complicated piece written for 4 hands. It started slow, like a gentle rain tapping on a window, soft and rhythmic. Then Rose reached over and hit the higher keys, adding a melody that danced over the top. It was a conversation between the two of them. Sophie was the steady ground, and Rose was the flight. The music grew louder and faster. It was full of joy and energy. It sounded like sunlight breaking through clouds. The audience leaned forward in their seats. They weren't just watching kids play. They were feeling the story of survival. They were hearing the journey from a dark, hungry kitchen to this bright stage. Julian closed his eyes and let the sound take him away. He remembered the cruel joke he had made that night. He remembered the look of fear in their eyes. He compared that memory to the sound of their playing now. The guilt was still there, a small stone in his heart. But it was covered by something else now, pride. Not pride in himself, but pride in them. He felt like a gardener who had almost cut down a rare flower, but then decided to water it instead. Now, watching it bloom, he felt a sense of awe. As the song reached its climax, the 2 girls were smiling. They were having fun. They were no longer playing for a plate of food. They were playing for the sheer love of it. Their fingers moved in a blur, hitting the keys with precision and power. Then, suddenly the music stopped. It wasn't an abrupt halt. It was a final, perfect chord that rang out into the silence. For 3 seconds, no one moved. The sound vibrated in the air. Then, the audience exploded. It wasn't just clapping. People stood up. They cheered, whistled, and shouted bravo. A woman in the 3rd row was wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. Sophie and Rose stood up and bowed deeply. They were grinning from ear to ear. They looked for their father in the crowd. He was standing in the back, wearing his work uniform, clapping so hard his hands were red. He was crying, but he was laughing too. Julian remained seated for a moment while everyone else was standing. He looked up at the girls. He realized that he hadn't just changed their lives. They had changed his. Before he met them, his house was just a big, empty place to sleep. His parties were just noise. He had everything money could buy, but he had nothing real.